Hello. Hello, this is Erica Young, and I am so excited today to that we are hosting today's webinar. Um, Before we get started, I just want to remind everyone that you can place any questions you may have in the Q&A chat function throughout the presentations, and there will be time at the end of the webinar dedicated to any additional questions. So just to set the scene here, mobile homes and manufacturing home communities are an affordable housing source in the United States with over 22 million residents. Unfortunately, many of these communities have been located on land that is increasingly vulnerable to flooding, while their homeowners face challenges to access adaptation tools. Um, there are We've got two speakers today who will be talking in depth about the paper that we're about to publish on the National Flood Insurance Program and manufactured housing. The first would be our facilitator, Rachel Skelly Siegel. She's senior officer at the Pew Charitable Trust. And then the author of our working paper that's coming out, Danny Slabow, who is the real estate development director at Tierra Colectiva Community Land Trust in Colorado. Danny and Rachel.
Hi everyone. Um, Nice to meet you all, or I'm glad you're here. And so today we're kind of going to start with an overview of some of the policy research. It's actually from a recently finished study with the University of Colorado, which is actually my dissertation. It was a community-based research project, and has some findings that are very relevant for policy reform and innovation when it comes to FEMA policy and manufactured housing policy in general. Um, this is, my title for this is Policy-Related Disasters from Disaster-Rated Policies. I'm really looking at the National Flood Insurance Program, mobile and manufactured housing, and stigma, and how stigma is operationalized through policy. So go ahead and move along. So I do just want to ground us um, in place and start off by inviting us to consider larger patterns of relationship to land, dispossession, and displacement. I'm joining this call from the historical homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute people, along with dozens of other Indigenous communities. I'm also specifically associated with the Auraria campus, University of Colorado, Denver, where working class, predominantly Latine Auraria neighborhood was forcibly removed through urban renewal. And so relevant to today's presentation, these groups, be it in the 1800s or the 1970s, have experienced structural violence and dispossession that really resonates with the structures of dispossession that mobile home communities and manufactured housing communities face. And so especially in this particular moment in history, I want to draw our attention to the ways that these patterns of enclosure and dispossession iterate across time so that we can draw our attention to the ways that we might be able to disrupt those deeper stories and structures and the ongoing damage that they cause. So the next slide. Um, so I want to start off by just naming that manufactured housing communities, specifically land lease manufactured housing communities, house about 5% of US households. And next, these are also called mobile home parks or trailer parks. Often in that world, we call them parks, but I want to just name that they're not particularly mobile after the housing unit has been placed. So they might be able to move once or twice, but they really are stuck in place after a little bit of time. That's about 7.2 million households in the United States. Is that lining up with this might be old numbers. But it's many times over the number of households that are in public housing that are in public housing owned homes, about a third of that housing is located in urban areas. So this is not necessarily just rural housing. This is urban housing that is also facing displacement pressure and in housing markets that are really impacted by speculation and sort of housing crisis that's affecting communities everywhere, but particularly in urban housing markets. So next. The one piece of this, there's a lot of different things that make this housing type particularly vulnerable to displacement. One of those things is that it has split ownership. And so this impacts um, land, the home value, and we'll talk about in a second how that ties into flood policy. But the housing itself is owned by each resident. In most cases, sometimes it's sort of leased or rented by the landowner, but it's separated from the property. And the land itself sits on all infrastructure, and all the infrastructure and improvements are owned and controlled by a landlord. Occasionally, the landlord is the community itself. Those situations are pretty wonderful and represent some positive direction in that world, but often it's a for-profit landlord and increasingly really more extractive models of ownership and investment. Next. Um, Another key difference is that manufactured housing communities are financially devalued through titling and lending structures. So not only is the value of the home separated from the value of the land through that split ownership structure, there's also a difference in how they're titled and some implications for lending. So with very few exceptions, these homes are titled as personal rather than real estate property. And so that is a distinction really based on the type of foundation is how it's generally codified in policy and law. And mobile home parks where folks are leasing the land as opposed to owning the land and the home and then affixing it and titling it as real property. Um, they don't have that permanent foundation. And so we see this as like the key point across multiple different contexts. That foundation type and the lease of land are really key ways in policy that we see mobile home parks as opposed to mobile homes on personal property or on private property separated out. That titling structure also, so they're titled generally as vehicles, and very few places, and New Hampshire is one, and maybe a handful of other states, allow for mobile homes in mobile home parks that are not on that permanent foundation to be titled as real estate. And so because they're titled as essentially vehicles, it really makes them hard to finance. There's very little mortgage access. The mortgage access that does exist tends to be incredibly high interest. And it really places a ceiling on the resale value and the valuation of those homes via cash purchases, or creates alternatively the conditions for exploitative contract financing. And so Pew Research has done some great work to investigate the role and the scope of that contract financing across different mortgage markets. And for the most part, we see, very little of that happening in real estate homes, sort of the traditional home ownership market. In the mobile home park home market, we really do see a lot more contract financing and very little mortgage access. Next. There's also a key difference between mobile homes and manufactured homes. And so in 1976, HUD rolled out a universal building code that is used for sort of ensuring quality across the manufactured housing sector. Homes built before that HUD code are called mobile homes. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they are not built to quality. There's, plenty that have been lovingly kept and cared for by their homeowners. But it does mean that they are ineligible for most federal and state grant funding. And so that's also a key difference in how all of this rolls out. Next. Um, on top of all of these different structural barriers, manufactured housing communities are facing displacement and redevelopment pressure in hot housing markets, including the Denver Boulder Metro and the entire state of Colorado, where real estate speculation has really come to bear in the last decade or so. In response, leaders and allies have really pushed back, resulting in some major legislative wins, including tenant opportunity to purchase laws that have given communities a fighting chance to enter municipal or nonprofit ownership, and in a slimmer set of circumstances where there are no lease to own arrangements, folks have clear title and friendly zoning laws to become resident-owned communities or ROCs. And so I just want to lift up that work and name that as the context that really led me to investigate some of these issues and the 50% rule and sort of the impacts of flood policy and disaster recovery policy in Colorado specifically. It's also one of the only states that, because of all of this advocacy, has a comprehensive database or pretty close to comprehensive database of manufactured housing inventory across the state, including every park that exists in the state. Next. And so next, this project really comes out of my doctoral dissertation research, and I conducted that research with community members in 2 resident-owned communities or ROCs in Colorado. Some of the first 2 to benefit from tenant opportunity to purchase laws in the state, and so they self-acquired during the pandemic, and soon thereafter, one of those communities faced a federally declared disaster through a straight line wind event that was associated with the Marshall fires. So they didn't actually experience fires themselves, but the straight line wind event and then the subsequent freeze and plumbing bursts and a whole set of cascading issues really followed that up. And so I worked with them as well as sort of a more stable rock in Durango on the western side of the state, also in a very hot housing market, but that hadn't faced those same disaster issues, did still have, 1 or 2 homes that sit inside a 100-year floodplain. And so we're having to navigate flood issues. And so next, really what we did a whole process of like, what do you want me to study, right? I came in as a researcher very aware of challenges around trust and relevance with a lot of academic research and really wanting to make sure that residents felt a sense of ownership and that they had direction over how that research carried forward, and that I was asking relevant questions that could be used for things like this, right? To work with a group like Lincoln Institute. And so what they wanted to share with me was that resident ownership was really a partial win, and that there were a lot of structural issues that were really exacerbating stress for residents and threatening displacement. So they had really strong attachment to their communities. They really saw, their neighborhood and their neighbors and sort of the social fabric of their communities as a real asset. I had a real desire to preserve affordability and create long-term sustainability. But this one particular rule and the way it intersected with a variety, it kind of creates this perfect storm, no pun intended, around disaster mitigation and preservation of affordability in their communities. So we dug into that a little bit further. And so as I dig into that, I think it's helpful next. That we can probably just keep clicking for a little bit. There you go. Okay, so that larger context. You can go to the next slide. Yeah. So a little background on the National Flood Insurance Program. So before 1927, flood insurance was largely handled in the private market. And that was a tipping point because of the Mississippi River flood. There's a map of that flood on this slide, and you can see it affected communities across the country, predominantly African American communities. And because of the level and the volume of damage and the number of insurance claims, it brought the flood insurance market to the brink of insolvency. And so after 1927, the flood insurance market disappeared, it evaporated. And it was really, there was no such thing as flood insurance. It's a very ad hoc government aid um, landscape to try and fill needs after disasters. Next. The National Flood Insurance Program gets introduced by Congress in 1968 as a publicly run flood insurance program. It's intended to be deeply subsidized and affordable, and really like a progressive public insurance and securitization of communities. In 1973, the National Flood Insurance Program is revised because the math isn't mathing. And they're starting to really get a feel for why the private market didn't want to touch the National Flood Insurance Program. So it's revised and introduces this 50% rule that is aimed the goal, and I think it's important to really think about that goal, is to limit floodplain investment in order to limit floodplain losses. So limit floodplain investment to 50% of a structure's value over any 10 consecutive years. And then in 2005 to the present, we've just seen sort of increasing financial pressure on that program. There are several $billion in debt, as far as I understand, and it's not changed the way it's trending. So post Katrina, it continues to face insolvency, and that is not slowing down as we see increased flood and hurricane damages across the country. Next slide. And so I really want to just take a moment and note a few things about the National Flood Insurance program's history. At no point have homes that have not been affixed to a permanent foundation, right? We see that like phrase, the permanent foundation phrase, come up again and again. That specifically is manufactured housing community homes in those land lease mobile home parks, as they are called. They have never been eligible for the National Flood Insurance Program. The National Flood Insurance, this is in part because the National Flood Insurance Program, it's that permanent foundation distinction, but then also this aspect of how the National Flood Insurance Program is enforced. And so the enforcement mechanism was tied to federally backed mortgages. So if you bought a Fannie or Freddie mortgage for your single family home, you were required to purchase flood insurance. And you couldn't get a federally backed mortgage without that flood insurance. A lot of people let that flood insurance lapse after they purchased it to get through closing, and that's been part of the issue. But you could not purchase, that was not an issue because there is no mortgage access for these homes, right? And so they fit into floodplains and in areas where you could not develop and effectively mortgage and resell single family homes. And so while anecdotal evidence, there's some, talked with a lot of different community members who talk about having flood insurance policies. It is really unclear how valid those policies are. I asked several folks, like, what was the process of applying for that insurance? Did they ask if it was a mobile home? Was that flagged at all? And they said no, they just asked for the address and a few other things, and now we have a policy. They've never had to file a claim on it, luckily, and so we don't know. But there's some evidence to suggest, based on like current NFIP guidelines, that those might not be necessarily valid policies that would be backed by the National Flood Insurance Policy. So moving on, what is this 50% rule? So what is that language? So SISD, or substantial improvement, substantial damage, which is referred to as a 50% rule, is a key part of the National Flood Insurance Program. And again, it's a strategy to reduce the cost of future damages to buildings in the floodplain. This is not meant to improve flood resilience for those neighbors. It is not meant to improve quality of life and like flood safety for those neighbors necessarily. It's intended to reduce the financial outlay that results from flooding. And so it's 50% of the building's market value. And again, we just talked about all the different ways that manufactured housing is devalued, right? It's considered one of the most widespread and effective forms of naturally occurring affordable housing, not because mobile homes and manufactured housing are inherently uh, low value, right? But because there's all these structures that strategically and systemically like devalue and lower the market price of that housing. And so because of that, this 50% rule is hit much sooner. So we can go ahead and next slide. I think I'm bleeding over into it. So MHCs or manufactured housing communities are disproportionately located in the floodplain, right? I think that's important to also acknowledge because of the way that the National Flood Insurance Program has been enforced, right? So single family homes, harder to locate in the floodplain. Folks had to have um, federally backed access to federally backed mortgages in many cases, and it just didn't make strategic sense for developers to develop single family homes in floodplain areas. Um, Communities also needed to have some sort of strategic plan that disallowed certain types of development in the floodplain. In many cases, mobile home parks and manufactured housing communities are considered not permanent housing, right? It's not titled as real estate. It could be moved. And so there's this argument that it's not a permanent community, and therefore shouldn't necessarily be subject to the same level of flood planning and mitigation as single family homes. And so that's one aspect of this. The other aspect is it's devalued because of the artificially devalued um, price of those homes. The 50% rule is triggered at much, much lower levels. And again, because the value of the home is separated from the land underneath it and purchase prices are limited by that financing ecosystem. That includes contract financing and other challenges. So as I jumped into this process, and I'm sorry, I'm not telling Layla to keep uh, clicking next. Yeah, you can keep going. Um, so really thinking about the extent of the policy's impact on Colorado. I came in and I wanted to crunch numbers and get the data. So how many mobile homes are actually located in the floodplain? Like we don't really have that data. And then within those communities, how many actual homes are in floodplain impacted, like actually intersecting the floodplain, not just in the park that intersects the floodplain, but actually directly in the floodplain. And then based on assessors data, which I collected from a variety of counties, what is the level of investment and for what percentage of mobile home community owners is the 50% rule potentially triggered? So is that, at a threshold where you're doubling the cost to comply with some of the requirements that come after you've hit that 50% rule, or sort of other thresholds that we kind of looked at. And then also thinking about that pre-1976, pre-HUD code homes that aren't able to access any kind of grants, federally backed or locally, statewide, often loans or low interest loans, other affordable housing resources that would potentially support compliance with 50% rural requirements, which are out there like flood mitigation requirements, but they're also very expensive and they don't have any way to finance them. So we can kind of go on to the next slide here. So I looked at the data. I got into GIS analysis of where we had data, and then to the extent possible, dug in across the state. There is not necessarily floodplain data for every county in Colorado, unfortunately, and there's also not necessarily parcel data that's digitized and available for geospatial analysis across all of the county or all of the state. There is location data, point data for every mobile home park across the state, thanks to advocacy and activism at a statewide level. And so I did have that. I was able to intersect that with parcels in several different counties and then request assessors data and go through an extensive process of cleaning that data, ensuring I was separating out homes that were on private property and not in parks. And then go through and clean that data, get your built out of all of the property descriptions, et cetera. It was a very long process of ensuring data quality. Came to have a smaller sample through that process of cleaning of 12 counties that had moderate to high quality data, and was used that to kind of get a range of property values in each county, and your built values across all of those 12 counties. And then overlaid that and intersected it with the number of homes that are in floodplains. So I also wanted, in thinking about like what thresholds we want to evaluate this, when the 50% rule is reached, when someone's invested half of the resale value of their home over 10 years in improvements or maintenance, the requirements, at least in Boulder, one of the communities that I worked with, in Sans Souci Cooperative, one of the folks said that for putting in a new home, the engineering, permitting, and construction installation costs of a home that's elevated to their requirements, which is about 4 feet or so, she said, was about $25,000. So she incorporated that into financing a new home that replaced an old one in the community, and that was in 2021. Things have changed, and financing is always evolving. But so I used 50,000. So the idea that it would double the price of the project as the cutoff for one of the thresholds, and then looked at 10,000 as our other cutoff. So that's about $500 a year of maintenance in a home. Go to the next slide. So what we found was a few different things. So 8.64% of the manufactured housing in parks in that 12 county sample was directly in the floodplain. We compare that with that housing type being about 5% of US households. And within that sample, households in those counties as an aggregate is just under 2% of households were in mobile home parks. So really highly disproportionate rate of manufactured homes in those communities that are intersecting the floodplain and exposed to that risk. When those mobile home communities or manufactured housing communities intersect a floodplain, about 25% of mobile homes in those communities are directly in the floodplain. So if there's a community that has 100 homes, about 25% of them are in the floodplain directly. This is important as we think about, the financial model and stability of resident-owned communities and other communities, that if something happens to those homes that are impacted by a flood, that can risk displacement or financial crisis for the entire community, because that land is owned collectively, right? So the tenure of some is the tenure of all. And then when we think about disproportionate sort of rates and scale of floodplain exposure, there's a second level of that. So about 25% of the mobile home communities were in floodplains, but there's about 34% of actual units that are located in those communities. So floodplain intersecting mobile home parks and manufactured housing communities are larger than communities that are outside the floodplain on average. So what's the impact of that the 50% rule in that 12 county sample? And how does HUD code or pre-HUD code come into this? So about 35.7% of units in that 12 county sample, so more than a third, were built before that 1976 HUD code. In Boulder, Colorado, that number was higher than 75%. So that means that in terms of affordable housing preservation 3/4 of the population of Boulder, Colorado that lives in a mobile home in a park can't access any type of support or funding or financing outside of locally distributed funds and locally raised funds. Um, if if the municipality has that as a priority, which in Boulder they likely do. How many units are valued at sort of various 50% rural thresholds? So under $10,000, right, which is triggering the rule before investing 5,000 over 10 years. Think about the cost of like repairing a roof, right? We have, hit that multiple times over by the time we get done with repairing a roof or replacing a roof or doing a whole lot of different things. And so that is about 36% of the pre-1976 units were appraised below $10,000. And again, that pre-1976 threshold, we really see a lot greater impact and a lot greater devaluation of those homes. And then 13.94% of post 76, so officially manufactured housing, not mobile homes, were appraised below 10,000. So it's a smaller number, but still pretty significant. And again, that's $500 a year that you could, use for improvements that are going to go through a permitting process, that are going to have a licensed contractor involved. That really limits your ability to maintain your home and improve it for long-term preservation. Looking at sort of what's under $50,000 based on sort of assessors data. Um, so again, that's going to trigger the rule and double cost of maintenance and improvements, around 25,000 in home improvements and maintenance over 10 years. So about 65.5% of the units in those 12 counties were valued below $50,000. And so we see this really playing out in ways that for folks in floodplains are really really damaging. We can go to the next slide. So some of those impacts, just based on sort of the qualitative aspects of that research, mobile home community homeowners will forego repairs and improvements or find ways to do them themselves. So they don't have to, arouse the attention of the city and permitting authorities. It really does cause declining living conditions and health and safety hazards. And so while this is meant to potentially, mitigate flood damage, it also creates conditions for amplified damage from other issues, right? Like a straight line wind event. If your roof or your siding hasn't been maintained or replaced, it's a lot more vulnerable to those things. Or if you haven't weatherized, or been able to accept even grant funds to help weatherize your home through weatherization or repair programs because you're concerned about hitting the 50% rule, that's causing undue exposure to extreme heat, which is another thing that these communities are quite vulnerable to. So there's these cross disaster impacts, right, is what I'm trying to get at. And it really does, it catalyzes and makes more extreme the disproportionate impact that extreme heat, extreme cold, and the financial burden of heating and cooling has for these predominantly low-income communities. So, and then for affordably preserved communities, they're going to face financial challenges post-disaster via loss of rents and barriers to repair or replacement because of those floodplain rules and the challenges of stabilizing folks who've faced disaster and their residents and tenants in those communities who have had sort of the most destabilizing thing possible happen to them, right? To have their home ruined through a disaster, but also for the entire community, because now that affordably preserved community faces financial instability because of those losses of rents. So I just want to wrap up with a few, if anyone knows FEMA, and can help us get a word in, which might be hard these days. This 50% rule needs to potentially shift. And I think adopting mobile home specific standards that allow for some flexibility, given that disproportionately low threshold, would be helpful. And, there's some ideas here. And then with FEMA, HUD, and state agencies developing equitable adaptation fund to support mobile home community owners who have triggered that 50% rule or who voluntarily opt in to adaptation through grants or low and no interest loans. So it's an impossible to finance mandate. The lack of mortgages that devalues these homes also makes it impossible to finance home improvements. There's no home equity in the same way we might think about it for a single family home. And so finding a way to support financing for those improvements so that it's not, come up with $25,000 or live in something you're not allowed to repair or replace. And so there needs to be a pathway for health and safety repairs. Last slide. Some model policy for that comes out of Boulder, Colorado, where mobile home park zoning that prevents speculative redevelopment, which sort of limits that overall property appreciation and long-term community impact of unit and rent loss. So when a community purchases the land underneath their homes in Boulder, it can only ever be the value of that land and that purchase can only ever be for a mobile home park. And it really limits the sale price and then limits the financial pressure of potentially having a disaster and losing, a lot or two of rents for a while as they pivot and adjust. There's also in Boulder, they have an unrestricted weatherization grant. There are no sort of limitations on who's eligible for that in terms of citizenship and other issues that we see frequently with federal grants. And so that it's a very flexible fund and they've been able to support mobile homes and weatherization and home repairs with that grant, regardless of unit age, regardless of, households, other things that come up in mobile home parks. In New Hampshire, we see real property titling and real property mortgage lending through a dedicated CDFI bank. So community development investment financial institution. I'm messing up the acronym, but and that really does help improve access to that housing type to help build equity and to stabilize those property values. I'd love to see more research on that, but that's for a different day. That's all I've got. Thank you.
Thanks, Danny. I'm really excited to dig into this today with you. Thanks for a great presentation. So I wanted to kind of zoom out a little. Let's see if I'm on the screen. Am I on the screen? Yeah, there I am. I wanted to kind of zoom out and think about the big picture here. So overall in the US, currently have a shortage of between 4 and 7 million homes. And the research shows that manufactured homes really play an important role across the country, both in existing housing and also as potential for new homes being built. But your work really brings up some extremely alarming challenges, specifically for manufactured homeowners that are in these land lease communities. So can you talk a little bit about how you see that big picture value of these homes?
Yeah, I think that, there's this like catch-22 where it's a double-edged sword in a lot of ways. These homes are naturally occurring affordable housing, right? Which we appreciate naturally occurring affordable housing, but they're kept affordable because of the stigma that's embedded in these policies, in the titling structures, in limitations on financial support for pre-76 homes, in, lack of mortgage access, and in contract financing, which is quite frequently very predatory. And so I think about, there's like a sort of neoliberal brand of housing development and housing policy that would say they're not valuable because they don't have this resale value. And I don't think that's right. Public housing also doesn't have a resale value. Permanently affordable housing also has a limited resale value. And we achieve that through covenants and all these other legal structures, and public ownership. And this is naturally occurring affordable housing, and it's kept affordable through these not so great things that we need to adjust. So how we preserve that affordable housing, and then support the residents in those communities to not just maintain affordability, but to build in long-term sustainability and ability to access capital that they need to improve their quality of life and really stabilize their communities, I think is really important. You could think about this as like use value versus exchange value. There's immense use value. There's immense like public value, and community value to having affordable housing, to having working class folks in our communities, to having seniors in our communities have access to safe and dignified communities where they feel a strong sense of belonging. And across the board, that's what I have heard from residents, is that that's the case.
Thanks, it's really helpful. So in addition to that, I've been hearing so much lately, and unfortunately seeing in the news so many natural disasters. They're increasingly common, and they're leaving all Americans to grapple with how to recover in all kinds of housing. Really deep challenges across the board. But can you talk about a couple of key differences in how FEMA and other insurance treat manufactured homes, specifically on rented land, differently than homes like another single family home that's owned as real estate and it's on its own land?
Yeah, I think the key differentiation there is that um, homes that are not on a fixed foundation, right? So you pour a slab, you affix the home when it arrives to the slab foundation or the pier and beam or whatever foundation structure. Those homes are then titled as real estate in most cases. And they are treated legally the same way that single family homes are. Um, when a home is in a land lease community in a park, right, where they're leasing the land underneath them, they are not affixed to a permanent foundation. They're on, piers that are temporary foundations, often tied down in ways that mitigate, potential flood and things moving and shifting. They're, secured, but it's not a permanent foundation. And so legally, they're not treated as homes. They're in most states, and out of Hampshire, I think there might be one or two other states, but really New Hampshire is like the main one. And so FEMA doesn't really mess with it. The National Flood Insurance Program there is no access to their federally backed flood insurance for those homes. Very specifically, it's very, to me,
Yeah, and I think, it brings up another one that I don't know if it came up in your research, but if it hasn't, do the permanent foundations reduce risks, or is functional purpose?
yeah, I could not answer that question for you. And I think there might be a logic there, and now I'm, pontificating, but there might be a logic there tied to sort of securitization of value, and that there's, that land is attached to this. It's not just an improvement that can be washed away. Um, but I think in general, and there's still stigma when I evaluate how policy zoning and architecture, uh, it really permeates. And kind of reflecting on that would be a good place to look.
Sure. Yeah, a lot of our work has, really highlighted that many of these policies were created when, these were literal trailers that would be hitched up and connected to a car. And so state law, like you said, often still treats them as personal property, just like an automobile. Yet they very rarely are moved. But that distinction often keeps them out of being treated like homes, which is what they are. So, kind of thinking along that line, one of the things that's come up in our research is that about half of manufactured homes are actually owned by the same person who owns the land. A lot of them are titled as real estate. It sounds like what you're saying is that in that scenario, these differences between other single family homes don't exist so much, or are there still differences there?
Yeah, I think, it might vary state to state. In Colorado, when they're titled as real property, when it's attached to land, they have the ability to be titled as real property. And that this is a world of difference, right? You can access a mortgage. You don't have to buy your house in cash, or with, sort of sketchy contract financing. There's a whole range of sort of rights and abilities that come with being a real property owner, and having that structure. And yeah, like you can get flood insurance for those homes as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so important because, on the one hand, we certainly want to preserve all the homes that we can. There's just such a drastic shortage. And then also and fix policies that just don't make sense anymore. And then also think about as we go forward and new homes get, built, developments are made and things like that. One of the things we're thinking a lot about is how the role of where we can place these, putting them on owned land in neighborhoods, treating them as real estate so people can get mortgages and be included in other disaster recovery and all the other ways that people stay stably in their homes seems really crucial. Um, so you mentioned about some of the low values of the properties. And it sounds like that's connected to, or actually because of the disconnection from the land. Is that about right? Are there other components there you see as devaluing these homes?
Yeah, I think that's like half the equation, right? And we see improvements separated from the value of the land and land trusts. We see, and across like affordable housing portfolios and policies, and those homes still retain their value largely because um, it's possible to access a mortgage. And so when you're trying to figure out home ownership, and you can't access a mortgage, that means is that home is going to be driven down to cash purchase prices. And so you'll see chain of title that has $10,000 or $20,000, or maybe it's 100,000, right? If it's a little bit newer. Maybe it is a little bit newer and you can still access financing, but that financing comes because it's loaning and lending on personal property rather than real estate. It comes with a much higher interest rate because it's considered riskier, which, depending on the situation, may or may not be true. I know there's been some research around that, and specifically with community, like affordably preserved parks and communities. Um, but it really drives down that property value, not because the home is inherently unworthy, right? But because there's no way to finance, unless you're willing to pay very exorbitant interest rates, and have a newer home that will pass muster with a bank, or you're able to arrange some sort of contract financing, which is an almost entirely unregulated sort of realm.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Our survey work really echoes that people who own their home as personal property were far more likely to have purchased in cash. And like, listen, some folks are downsizing, they don't want a loan, but it was a shockingly high, over 70% said that they bought in cash. Given that these are such low income households, it's really shockingly high percentage who are buying in cash. Um, So, you mentioned that homes that are not permanently attached to land are not eligible for FEMA National Flood Insurance Program, which has the 50% rule. But that also that rule prevents important improvements for manufactured homeowners and communities because of that low value. Can you help me understand how something that they're not eligible for is preventing them from being able to make, whatever updates seem prudent?
Yeah. Um, So the way the National Flood Insurance Program is works is the federally backed mortgage aspect is one aspect of enforcement and like operationalized, impact. Another one is through local municipalities. So if you are trying to, let's say you have a mobile home that you live in, pre-1976, it's worth $40,000, and you decide you need to repair your roof, like shingles have been falling off, it needs a new roof. You get an estimate and it's $20,000. That's going to trigger the 50% rule. If you decide to go through with it anyways, so the city is in charge of your permits, right?
Yep.
You've got to, if you want to work with a licensed contractor, unless that contractor is willing to risk their career, they're going to pull a permit. And in order to pull that permit, they need to get approval from the city that's going to look at, are you in the floodplain? Is this triggering the 50% rule? If you are triggering the 50% rule, they might disallow the permit. They might attach fines to it. They might say, you can't do this unless you lift your house and you pay, $25,000 in engineering costs and permitting fees to lift the house first before you put a new roof on. And so then, the next time a high wind event comes through or a hurricane or, a large event, the other thing that plays into this, anyone who's like been in a disaster zone after disaster and help people navigate FEMA knows that FEMA will deny your claim if they think that you have not maintained your property. And so that it's based on, prior damage, right? Or prior neglect of the property. The whole claim will be denied. And so it not only prevents people from maintaining their homes the way that they want to and should, but it also can have other ramifications for accessing sort of emergency aid, and allocations from FEMA after a disaster.
Yeah. So it's like a bunch of catch-22s kind of going on here. Yeah, that's really tough.
It's no good.
Thank you. That's super helpful because that was one of the things that I'm kind of trying to figure out is, how are these two things happening at the same time? So that makes sense, unfortunately. So we have a couple questions. One of them has to do with looking at states or maybe even localities. Have you seen any examples of places where they're trying to help manufactured homeowners and residential communities protect from future expected flooding, especially in areas losing access like Florida to insurance?
Yeah. This is like also where I'm kicking it back to the policy researcher, for sure. Would love to hear what you have to say. Here in Colorado, there's been a few efforts to improve weatherization in particular. Extreme heat is something that folks are dealing with increasingly, as well as extreme cold and cold snaps. And so the City of Boulder's Climate Resiliency Fund, and again, like unrestricted money because it's from a local fundraising source, but to sort of just regardless of value, regardless of year built, regardless of anything else, investing 10,000 in every home that applies, and that's like an allocation. Like, yes, we will help you weatherize, we'll help you insulate, we'll help you, do what's necessary for health and safety. That doesn't necessarily that can intersect with the 50% rule, right? Because they're also, looking at public investment that goes into those homes and counting that towards that 50% value. So I think also thinking about um, ways that that value can be bolstered while still maintaining affordability. So what is it, the different titling structures, and allowing for titling to be, outside of the DMV, as
Mhm.
my friend in Animas View Mobile Home Park says, not vehicles.
Yeah, and one of the things that struck me when you were talking about all the work that you've done and the 50% rule is that there's a really big difference between putting in my mind, as I think about this 50% rule, preventing exorbitant costs for the flood insurance program. You're thinking about somebody's changed out, like redone their kitchen, and it's all like super high-end stuff, as opposed to putting in flood mitigation um, steps that are going to really keep the home safe, help making sure that the roof is repaired so you don't have mold, and that you have a safe place to live. Those are really different things in
Yeah.
my thinking. And again, this is kind of off the top of my head, but as I think about this, I wonder if there's room to start considering some carve outs to be able to consider how do we, you know, approach good solid maintenance as opposed to lavish upgrades.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's like tricky things in the middle, but it
Yeah.
seems like
And
it's time to just take a fresh look at those things.
absolutely. Yeah, I always think about one of the homeowners that I worked with and who was part of my steering committee for this research, who's an 80-year-old woman, and she's deeply attached to her pre-1976 home. And there are differing opinions about the value of that home, but as far as she's concerned, over her dead body, are you taking it away from her? It's the home that she raised her kids in. It's where she sort of got free from a less than ideal relationship, and found stability as a single mom. And she's lived there for more than 50 years. And so it's pre-1976. She lives on Social Security minimums, fixed income, very low income. And um, after a major flood, or not major flood, after a major disaster, she didn't have running water for months, like for more than a year.
Wow.
She was filling up buckets to help flush her toilet. She, all sorts of challenges. And this is an 80-year-old woman, right? This is a beloved participant in the community. And so folks, tried to help the best they could, but the community, the state, disaster funds wouldn't touch the house because it was pre-1976. The State Department of Housing, said, well, we could potentially replace the house, and she wanted none of that. She didn't trust it. And so like there's, people have deep attachment to place and deep attachment to their homes. This is very personal. And while it's policy and while we need to think about the big picture, we also need to think about like how that translates down to the micro scale. And the fact that her home is valued at like $10,000
Yeah.
really prevents her from being able to pay someone to keep it up, and help her make those repairs. So stuff like having running water, like we live in the United States of America. We should all have
Yeah.
running water. That should be
Yeah.
well below the floor.
Yeah, absolutely. So much more to do here and to think about, how we shift policies and modernize them. And unfortunately, we're at time, but this was great. Thanks so much. And I think we're going to kick it back over to the Lincoln folks.
All right, great.
Well, Rachel, Danny, thank you so much for this really fascinating webinar on public policy related disasters with the National Flood Insurance Program, mobile and manufactured housing, and stigma. And thank you all for attending. Please feel free to reach out to the Lincoln Institute if you have additional questions or comments. And I thank you all for participating. Bye-bye.